When police entered the house on the morning of June 14, 2006, silence fell upon them heavier than the smell of iron and semen. Two bodies lay in the living room, a man and a young man, their hands still touching. Blood spattered the wall, like traces of an internal explosion spreading across the wallpaper. Nearby lay a pistol and an open laptop, its screen still lit. The Morris family lived in a quiet suburb of Wakefield, Maine. The house was purchased in 2001 after the second marriage of Catherine Morris, a nurse at a local clinic. Her new husband, Gerald Pearson, worked as an auto mechanic and was considered a quiet, reserved, but hardworking man. Catherine's son from her first marriage, 16-year-old Ethan, lived with them full-time. For a town where most people knew each other, their family seemed ordinary. A modest plot of land, 2 cars, and Sunday church-going. The first months after the wedding passed uneventfully. Neighbors noted that Gerald seemed like a caring stepfather. He helped Ethan repair his old moped, took him fishing, and showed interest in his studies. Neighbors later testified that they looked like father and son, even too close. At the city garage where Pearson worked, colleagues recalled how he often boasted about his stepson's successes and showed him photos on his phone. In the pictures, they stood side by side with identical smiles and matching caps. Over time, Gerald's attention to Ethan became constant. He offered to pick him up from school and spent evenings together, leaving Catherine alone. At first, she dismissed it, thinking he was simply trying to build a relationship with the teenager. However, she soon began to notice details uncharacteristic of ordinary affection. They would sit for hours in the garage behind closed doors, and Gerald would become irritated if anyone tried to enter. When Catherine happened to peek in one evening, she saw them quickly pull away from each other, as if caught in the act of something intimate. Ethan looked embarrassed, but remained silent. The family's relationships began to change. Ethan began speaking to his mother less often, avoiding her questions and skipping meals. His demeanor became tense, as if he were hiding something. Gerald, on the other hand, showed marked concern. He helped with housework, repaired furniture, and acted like a model husband. But the distance between him and Catherine grew. According to her friend, Catherine couldn't explain why she began to feel uneasy about her husband. She simply felt something was wrong in the house. Since 2003, Ethan stopped attending school sports. Instead, he spent time with his stepfather in the garage. There, they had an old TV, a refrigerator, and a fold-out sofa. Sometimes they stayed there until late at night. One neighbor claimed to have seen Ethan leaving the garage after midnight in his street clothes, but thought nothing of it. In the middle of that year, Catherine found her son's t-shirt in the laundry, someone else's, an adult size, and smelling of the men's cologne Gerald wore. She didn't ask any questions, but from that moment on, arguments began between the couple. Gerald accused her of jealousy and of destroying the family. Ethan, in turn, became defensive of his stepfather, becoming increasingly distant from his mother. By 2004, the house had been divided into 2 parts: the domestic part, where Catherine ran the household, and the private part, where Gerald and Ethan lived. They would sometimes be absent from the house all evening, returning late. Catherine tried to talk to her son several times, but he responded briefly, avoiding her gaze. A diary later found among his belongings contained the entry, "He's the only one who understands me. I feel safe with him." No one suspected then that this quiet affection was gradually turning into an addiction, devoid of its usual boundaries. Outwardly, the family continued to live as before. Holidays, photos on social media, rare visits from guests. But inside the house, a silence was growing, thick and unnatural. Catherine increasingly spent the night at work, citing overtime as an excuse. She avoided returning home unless absolutely necessary. In her medical reports from that time, colleagues later found strange notes: frequent migraines, sleep disturbances, obsessive thoughts. No doctor at the time knew the cause was not physiological. Everything changed in early 2005 when the woman found a photograph in the trash. It showed Gerald and Ethan topless, standing by a lake. The photo was taken casually, as if by accident, but the expressions on their faces spoke of a closeness beyond mere kinship. She hid the photo but didn't tell anyone. A month later, Catherine filed for divorce. Gerald insisted they try to start over for Ethan. She agreed, but only partially. She moved in temporarily with her sister. Only 2 people remained in the house, a man and a boy, and it was then, according to the investigation, that the stage began that experts would later call the latent fusion phase, when emotional dependence becomes physical and personal boundaries are completely blurred. It is from here that the chain of events begins. that will lead to that morning in June 2006 when police discover two bodies in the living room, side by side, in a silence broken only by the hum of the computer. After their mother left home, Gerald and Ethan's relationship became almost isolated from the outside world. They lived in a small one-story building where the windows were rarely opened and the phone only went to an answering machine. Neighbors noticed the man and the boy going out together, to the store, to the garage, to the woods, and always returning together. It seemed they formed a closed system, inaccessible to anyone else. According to the case file, it was during this period that what investigators would later call the mechanism of addiction began. Ethan dropped out of school, citing health problems. Gerald claimed he would take over his education himself. During the day, they repaired cars, and in the evenings, they watched old movies or sat by the lake. Letters and notes found after the tragedy indicate that Ethan considered his stepfather his only friend and the only person who would not betray him. Over time, their communication became more intimate. Gerald often complimented the boy's body, pressed him to exercise and watch his diet. His words conveyed a mixture of care and control. In one email sent from his home computer, he wrote, "You're becoming what I always wanted to be. Don't let me go while I'm here." Forensic experts confirmed the authenticity of these messages. Her mother, Catherine, tried to maintain contact. She called in the evenings, but the conversations were limited to short phrases like, "Everything's fine, Mom. We're busy." At some point, the phone stopped answering altogether. Her attempt to drop by unannounced ended with the door not being answered. The next day, she received a message from Gerald. "Don't interfere. We'll handle this ourselves." Signs of normal life gradually disappeared from the house. Photos from family celebrations were removed from the walls, and Ethan's room resembled a bedroom, empty of books, bare of clothes, with the curtains drawn. The investigative report noted that all electronic devices in the house, the television, the laptop, even the old radio, were tuned to only one room, where they spent all their time together. Witnesses described Gerald as becoming irritable and withdrawn. He avoided socializing, didn't show up for work, and dismissed the garage staff, claiming he was taking a break to recuperate. None of his former colleagues have seen him since. In May 2005, Catherine went to the police station to check on her son. There was no formal reason. Ethan was an adult. The police merely recorded the report, noting that no life-threatening situation was identified. When the officer arrived at the house, Ethan himself answered the door. He appeared calm and confidently stated that he was living with his stepfather of his own free will. Gerald stood behind him, smiling. The investigation was unsuccessful. However, from that moment on, Ethan's behavior became more erratic. According to neighbors, he would stand by the window at night, looking out onto the street as if waiting for someone. Sometimes he would go out onto the porch in his underwear, sit on the steps, and remain silent. A diary later found in his room contained the following entry. He says, "Love is when no one has the right to interfere. I try to understand, but I'm afraid." Forensic psychologists later noted that by this time, the young man's dependence had taken on the characteristics of subordination. He no longer made independent decisions, relying entirely on his stepfather. Any disagreement would trigger outbursts of anger in Gerald, followed by reconciliation with gifts, promises, and special time together. Catherine tried to intervene again. She arrived at the house unannounced. She said Ethan opened the door, but upon seeing his mother, he immediately locked himself in. A few minutes later, Gerald came out, said everything was under control, and asked her not to destroy the world they had built. She noticed a bruise on her son's neck, but he merely shook his head. After that, she never returned. In the fall of 2005, police received an anonymous tip about possible inappropriate behavior in the Pearson home. An inspection again yielded nothing. The house was clean and quiet, and Ethan declared the rumors false. But in his report, the inspector noted one detail. There was a sense of tension and a strange silence in the room, as if the residents were trying not to breathe loudly. By the end of the year, their relationship had become completely disconnected from reality. Ethan stopped going out. Gerald did all the shopping. Bank statements showed dozens of orders for anonymous internet services and private forums dedicated to alternative relationships. Investigators later determined that this was the beginning of their documented intimate relationship. Of the outside world, only the walls of the house and the two of them remained. No guests, no visits, no phone calls. Life around them was ordinary. Neighborhood barbecues, children playing on the lawn, city festivals, But behind the curtained windows of the Morrises' house, an addiction was developing, in which attachment and fear merged into one. By the end of spring 2006, the situation had become unstable. Ethan increasingly wrote about a feeling of suffocation and fear of being alone. Gerald, on the other hand, began to show signs of jealousy and control. He began monitoring his boyfriend's emails, demanding proof of devotion, and forbidding even short, unaccompanied walks. In one letter sent shortly before the tragedy, Ethan wrote, "Sometimes I think if we die, all this will end, and then no one will know." These words proved prophetic. Soon 2 shots rang out in the house, and Wakefield would wake up to a morning that would change his story forever. The spring of 2006 marked a turning point. By then, the house where Gerald and Ethan lived had become a closed space where the rules of the outside world were defied. According to investigators, the windows were almost never opened. All the mirrors in the house were removed, and the phones were disconnected. Gerald explained this by saying that the outside world prevents them from being themselves. For Ethan, this had become the norm. In photographs found on their computer, they pose in matching shirts, holding hands. Some were taken in the bedroom, others by the lake where they used to fish. Police determined that these shots were taken by Gerald himself using a tripod. The files are dated March 2006. Around that time, Ethan stopped appearing on social media. All his previous posts were deleted, and his accounts were closed. Forensic psychologists would later call this period a moment of total control. Gerald no longer hid the fact that he considered their relationship real, requiring no social approval. In correspondence recovered from their hard drive, he wrote, "We are above the law. They simply won't understand. The main thing is, don't tell anyone. That's our belief." In April, Catherine tried to contact her son through acquaintances. She left a letter under his door, but it was returned, folded, and charred. Soon after, she received a short message from an unknown number. "He's happy. Don't ruin it." Her number was then blocked. She contacted a private investigator, but after checking the house, he said, "2 men live there. They look fine. There's no reason to interfere." However, inside the house, things were happening that would later form the basis of the indictment. Gerald began recording their conversations together. In the audio recordings found by police, he can be heard demanding proof of loyalty from Ethan. The young man responds quietly, restrained, but there's a hint of weariness in his voice. Experts later determined that these conversations were conducted almost daily as a kind of ritual of trust. Gradually, dependence took the form of subordination. Ethan followed his stepfather's orders, even when they defied common sense. He stopped sleeping in his room, ate on a schedule, and didn't leave without permission. One of his last letters, written on a piece of paper from a notebook, reads, "Sometimes I wake up and don't know who I am." He says I'm his reflection. Maybe that's how it's supposed to be. By May, their life had become reminiscent of a closed cult. Gerald rarely left the house. All financial transactions were handled through online wallets registered in Ethan's name. Electricity and water bills were paid irregularly. Soon, a neighbor reported loud voices coming from the house at night. Not shouts, but monotonous conversations. An inspection revealed no violations. The doors remained closed again. It was during this time, according to investigators, that several conflicts between them occurred. One of them resulted in a physical altercation. The photographs found showed bruises on Ethan's shoulder and cheek. Forensic experts determined that the injuries were inflicted 2 to 3 weeks before his death. However, as forensic experts established, each conflict was followed by a reconciliation, emotional and then physical. At the end of May, Gerald purchased a weapon, a Smith & Wesson pistol. He listed it in the paperwork as for self-defense. 2 weeks later, the same pistol would turn up on the living room floor next to 2 bodies. On June 6th, neighbors noticed that the curtains in the house hadn't been drawn back for several days. The mailbox was overflowing. 2 pairs of shoes covered in dust stood on the porch. Investigators would later determine that it was during this period that Gerald completely lost control of his psyche. In one of his letters found in email drafts, he wrote, "He's starting to look at me differently. I can't let him go. If he goes, I'm gone." On June 11th, Catherine tried calling again. There was no answer. She left a message, "Ethan, please just tell me you're alive." The next day, her call was rejected again. 2 days later, the phone was no longer working. The last days of their lives were reconstructed from digital traces. On June 12th at 9:47 p.m., Ethan visited a website with religious texts. At 10:13 p.m., an email with the subject, "Sorry, Mom," was sent from the same computer. It was never read. According to investigators, they had an argument on the night of June the 13th and 14th. Gerald accused Ethan of intending to leave the house and reveal the secret. There was a struggle, then a gunshot. The first was to the young man's chest, the second to his own temple. There were no signs of a struggle in the room, only an overturned chair and a photograph of them together, on which someone had written in marker, "Now, no one will separate us." On the morning of June 14th, the police broke down the door. The computer was on, and the same letter was open on the screen. "We tried to live right." The scene was silent. The house smelled of metal and dust. There were handprints on the walls, and the shadow of two bodies fallen side by side on the floor. It was the end of the addiction, but not of its consequences. Police arrived at the house on Willow Street at 9:26 a.m. A neighbor had called, concerned that the windows hadn't been opened for a week, and the smell coming from the property was becoming overpowering. Officers found the front door locked from the inside. The lock had to be forced open. The first person to enter the house, Sergeant Langley would later say in his report, "I knew immediately they were dead. This wasn't just a murder, it was a life stopped." The bodies of Gerald Pearson and Ethan Morris lay on the living room sofa. The man was sitting, leaning against the back, his head thrown back, the gun still clutched in his hand. The young man lay nearby, on his side, his face partially covered by his hand. Both were dressed in simple loungewear, gray t-shirts and sweatpants. On the floor near the table sat a laptop with an open text document. On the screen was an unfinished sentence. "We did this together because otherwise..." The investigative team arrived within half an hour. The crime scene was meticulously documented. In addition to bloodstains, fingerprints from both men were found on the walls, but no traces of others were found. The house was tidy, unusual for a spontaneous murder. Everything was arranged symmetrically, objects were neatly laid out, and even the murder weapon was positioned at a precise angle to the bodies. Forensic experts would later note that everything looked like a staged calm. The initial theory was murder, followed by suicide. Forensic experts determined that the shots were fired within a minute of each other. The bullet that killed Ethan entered at a close range, at a right angle. Traces of gunpowder particles were found on Gerald's right hand. The conclusion was obvious. He shot the young man first, then himself. But investigators quickly realized the case was more than just a domestic dispute. They found dozens of password-protected folders on the computer. Inside were photographs, correspondence, and audio files. The materials described a relationship that had lasted for years and contained fragments indicating Ethan's emotional and physical subjugation. In some letters, Gerald wrote, "If they ever come, we'll leave together. They won't get us." An archive of video recordings was also found on the hard drive. The first file was dated 2003, the last a week before the murder. Forensic experts confirmed their authenticity. The footage depicts scenes from home together, dinners, walks, and sometimes arguments ending in reconciliation. The final recording ended with Gerald saying, "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Catherine Morris arrived at the morgue that evening. The report states that she was unable to personally identify the bodies, as her condition prevented her from doing so. She later gave a brief statement. "I lost both. One was my son, the other was the one I brought into my home." The media immediately picked up the story. Headlines ranged from the subdued to the sensational. A mystery of love and death in a quiet suburb. Murder or ritual? The city council debated whether to disclose details of the case, lest it spark a wave of speculation. But information leaked. Excerpts from the letters were released publicly, and attention to the case escalated nationally. The investigation lasted several months. FBI experts joined in the analysis of digital data. They examined medical records, psychiatric reports, and financial documents. It was discovered that Gerald had stopped paying his bills early and sold his tools from the garage. 2 days before his death, he withdrew $100 from a joint account. The money was never found. Psychologists invited to analyze the case concluded that a closed emotional system had formed between the stepfather and stepson, in which one acted as a source of dependency and the other as a reflection of his fears. The experts called this voluntary captivity syndrome. Essentially, Ethan wasn't trying to escape. He no longer saw himself outside the relationship. A separate line of investigation concerned a note on the laptop screen. Analysis of the font and typing speed revealed that the text was written by Ethan, but the last line was in Gerald's handwriting. This meant that they had indeed composed the letter together. Investigators believed the decision to die was mutual. Although it was his stepfather who initiated it, the public reaction to the findings was mixed. For most Wakefield residents, it came as a shock. At the family's church, the pastor spoke of sin and temptation. At the same time, some journalists pointed to a systemic failure, the inaction of the services, which ignored the mother's complaints. When the case was officially closed, over 1,000 pages remained in the archive. Transcripts of correspondence, and expert reports. On the final page of the report, investigator Morgan Hughes wrote, "It's unclear which of them first uttered the idea of death, but one thing is clear. Life in this house ceased long before the shots were fired." The following spring, the house on Willow Street was sold at auction. The new owners removed the carpets and replaced the wallpaper, but the iron smell persisted. Neighbors claimed to hear clicking sounds coming from the living room at night, like someone opening a laptop again and typing words they'd left unfinished. There was no formal trial. The defendant was dead. But the Pearson Morris investigation continued for nearly a year. The District of Maine Judicial Council held public hearings to determine whether the tragedy could have been prevented. Psychologists, teachers, neighbors, and social workers testified at the hearings. Everyone tried to explain how two people could have lived in isolation for so long, and no one intervened. Excerpts from their correspondence were shown on the court screen. A deathly silence reigned in the courtroom. The letters Gerald sent to Ethan sounded like a mixture of confessions and threats. "You are my mirror. Without you, I will disappear. If you ever leave, I will take you with me." These lines, according to experts, were a direct foreshadowing of the finale. The commission acknowledged that signs of abuse and psychological control were obvious, but the child welfare system and law enforcement ignored them. Police reports included complaints from the mother, but none were classified as a safety threat. Social services attributed this to a lack of direct evidence. The adult son was unwilling to cooperate. In March 2007, the investigation's final findings were published. The 247-page document detailed the chronicle of their addiction, stating that the relationship was one of mutual control, with the roles of victim and dominant constantly shifting. The experts noted that in the final months before his death, Ethan began to recognize the abnormality of his situation, but his emotional bond with his stepfather prevented him from leaving. The media used the case as an example of pathological love. Talk shows debated the limits of personal freedom, and psychologists debated the concept of voluntary submission. Some reports crossed the line into sensationalism, presenting the story as a twisted romance. For the mother, it all became a second torture. She publicly asked for an end to the speculation, declaring, "This isn't love. This is destruction disguised as we." The house stood empty for a long time. In 2008, it was put back on the market, but the deals fell through. The new owners, who bought the property 3 years later, discovered during their first inspection that the electrical outlets in the walls had been taped over from the inside, and dozens of handwritten notes in Ethan's handwriting were hidden behind the baseboards. They contained short phrases like, "I wake up and don't know who I am," and "He says I'm his breath." These fragments were transferred to the county archives. The case was finally closed. The report stated, cause of death, gunshot wounds, motive, addiction, and fear of loss. A new house now stands on the site, but residents of the neighborhood still call the property that house on Willow. In the evenings, when the wind rustles the trees, people say they hear two voices, one mature, calm, the other youthful, muffled, as if repeating every word. So the silence once again closes in on itself, a circle from which they once could not escape.